welcome to another episode looking behind the curation of Total Recall, Myth and Memory. It's a great exhibition that's on at the Mercer Gallery in Harrogate until October the 15th. And I am joined by one of the photographers in the show, Liza Dracup. Now, Liza is an incredible photographer, but also an academic, being a senior lecturer in photography at Leeds, Trinity. Thank you so much for joining me today. We are currently in the location of one of your photographs that's in the exhibition, and it is this beautiful image of snow at night here just outside Bingley in the north. You do most of your work in the north. Why did you choose this spot, and can we learn a little bit more behind this image? Like, how did you do this process? How do you get into night photography? What is it that attracted you to creating that image?
Right, I mean, there's a lot to cover there, but in terms of this specific location, it came out of a commission from the former director, James Sellers, at the Mercer Art Gallery, and she was working on a huge exhibition with Alexander Robertson in terms of looking back on the work of John Atkinson Grimshaw, famed for Victorian painter, famed for his paintings of moonlight.
Yeah.
So she'd seen a previous body of my work, Sharp's Wood, where it was a site-specific piece of work where I worked for many years in a specific woodland on the edge of Bradford at night. So I created this huge body of work, and that's the work I'm primarily known for, as Sharp's Wood. But then Jane saw that work, and because she'd been wanting an artist to respond to the huge oeuvre of John Atkinson Grimshaw, she approached me. So therefore I started out looking at locations that were specific, site-specific, and related to where Grimshaw had actually painted, in the city centre of Leeds, in Whitby, in Scarborough. I stayed in locations in the north, and I'd done the docks in London. And I looked at one of his paintings of the mill. And this landscape, you see, I've photographed in St Ives, in Bingley and in the Bradford district. I photographed in this woodland throughout my photographic career. You see, I have these threads that I return to. Not that I'm stuck in them, because I can branch off, but there's certain landscapes that really, if you looked back in my back catalogue, you'll see how my work's developed right from the start with this very experimental thread in terms of approach to landscape. Yeah, but this site was very much in terms of, if you look behind this ferns, the motif of the fern, and Terridomania that swept kind of Victorian Britain, that people are obsessed with ferns. I love the kind of reference to that, and the moss-covered boulders, the millstone grit-covered boulders, and that, in some ways, for me, they were kind of cues, and they reflected what Grimshaw, self-taught pre-Raphaelite is known as. His responses to specific places, and in terms of the vegetation, in terms of specific places and habitats.
That's phenomenal. I think that is so innovative, of taking the cues from somebody else and your own skills and merging them together. And I like that it's not just about moonlight, but also about that interest that Victorians would have. It's taking that culture from that time,
absolutely,
and transposing that to now.
I think, because you pick up on that as well, it's because of the work whilst I was doing the Grimshaw work, and currently as well using the archives at the Science and Media Museum Insight. Obviously, Grimshaw, his timeline really aligns with the time of the invention of photography as well, and the ways of seeing the world afresh through the lens, and the fixed image. I know the lens dates back a long time before, and in terms of seeing through a lens with the camera obscura and things like that. However, that fixed image, to be able to study the portability of an image, I think that's a great process. I found that really interesting, because whilst I was making the work for Chasing the Gloaming, which two of the works, the Snow and the Whitby photograph, is from, I just did and have continued to do extensive research into archives of named famous photographers, Anna Atkins, William Henry Fox Talbot, but there's a lot of anonymous photographers, and I find anonymity and bodies of work that are in these collections and archives, I find so interesting. And I find it's so interesting when you've got an established departure point and it's about mapping that back onto a landscape of now, tying in with issues that relate to now, environmental concerns, habitat, in terms of if we came back in 50 years' time, what would this space look like? Would it look the same? I would imagine if we go back in time, things obviously would be smaller, but species would be probably quite similar. But as we go forward, there's so much embedded, isn't there, within the landscape and how we read landscapes. But I'm very interested in terms of my photography, in terms of ideas around bringing to the attention sometimes the ordinary, the everyday, well, not necessarily everyday, but things that people just pass by and seem familiar with, and drawing attention through photography. And I think that is something, it's not new, it's a long established thread in photography. And I think photography as a medium is so interesting because I'm still interested after all these years now. And the darkroom, I'm making work in the colour darkroom now. I've got access to the colour darkroom, and I'm also aware of, since I started photography and picked up a camera in the mid-80s, that so much shifts. Some things have gone and now obsolete. You can't get anything anymore. Some things went and have come back, like the Polaroid went back and came back, in terms of back into probably more mainstream. But there's so much kind of like film stock. When I made the work in this wood and Sharp's wood, I used Kodak medium format 120 vivid colour VC, and they had two. They had neutral colour and vivid colour, and now this portrait film, which is brilliant because we're going to go into technicalities here. In terms of reciprocity failure, once you're doing an extended exposure at night, because I find that interesting in terms of a lot of photography and the wider perceptions of photography kind of locate in ideas around instantaneous and language of photography, snap, click, bish, bosh. Whereas, again, this extended moment beyond that of vision. And photography in itself, as we know, kind of extended what we know about the human world in terms of vision, both on this planet and in astronomy as well, because that opened up so much to us.
But it also kind of has opened up different avenues of how we share, how we engage, and how we value art as well. There's a lot, I feel, at the minute that's about time. Is this image or object of value because somebody has taken time to make it? And I feel that photography is often diminished because it can just be that click, that moment, that snap. Even if there's been a lot of build-up of planning, of lighting, of invested resources in taking that snap. But I love what you do with these works of taking like long exposure photography, because, and this is what I really wanted to ask as well, is do you find that you see things in your images that you didn't see as a person when you're in that place? Because of the time that lens had to capture what was there.
Yeah, definitely. I think that in terms of night photography, because I'm currently still testing out things with night photography ideas. Going back to the Sharp's Wood body of work, I picked up an inexpensive camera with a fantastic lens. It was a Kershaw camera, and I picked it up in a charity shop in Leicester. And I was doing a master's in photography at that point under the tutorage of Paul Hill, renowned photographer. And basically, landscape was of interest to me then. And getting that camera, I thought, what can I change about how I approach landscape photographically? And that Kershaw camera, because I noticed things about nighttime, whether you're walking or driving or being driven through particular areas. I mean, I remember the Twines here when I was a child. I actually thought this road was quite intimidating, especially at night with the trees as you wound up it. And I think we have a collective fear of the night. I think that's part of it. But in terms of what the camera sees and my photographer's experience, whilst making work at night, and then actually, because predominantly all that was made on negative, it's analogue, it was not, and I must stress, it's not been photoshopped or manipulated after, it was printed directly from the negative as a print. Yeah, I did the work prints because I worked as a colour hand printer as well, photographic hand printer, but because of the scale and the size, they had to go to London to be enlarged. But what the camera sees at night is a totally different spectrum of colour. And I think when people first see my night works, they feel familiar. However, there's a kind of another side where there's something that doesn't quite fit with expectations of a daylight photograph. And they might read the title. If they read the title, because sometimes I do most times put brackets night, so people have, they can actually access work. Because I feel it's good to make work accessible sometimes by interpretation, and give it a wider context and situate, curiosity or in the audience to actually allow them to read it as well as the straightforward image. In terms of making work, I'm still forever fascinated with the colours that the camera sees, the spectrum of colour, because I did a few photographs in this location here, and there was the night photograph, and there were 2 other photographs, and they responded to Grimshaw's mill photograph. And what I found particularly exciting was in the daylight photographs, and in a bit in the snow picture, the photographs at night captured some of the colours that Grimshaw had in his mill photograph. And how could he have known those colours existed in that night time? You don't know until the camera captures them, and that's why I think you've got these kind of opposites, these paradoxes in photography, because sometimes in the night photographs it can look like it's depicting day and night at the same time. This idea of truth and illusion, and I always feel the word in terms of the magic of photography has never left me as an artist as well.
So one of the things that I think is so important about photography, particularly how we look at it today, with the rise of everybody having a camera in their pocket, is that illusion aspect of photography. Because I feel like there's an assumption that cameras capture truth. And when the photograph is not necessarily matching up to what you assume is there or what perception you might have of a place, it really kind of challenges how you experience, like what is the truth of experience, what is the truth of the world around us. And sometimes when it's not matching up, there's quite a confusing discourse that happens internally for a person. And I really relish that moment because it gives me a chance to reflect on my own experiences and my own sense of place in the world. But I think it's quite an unusual experience, and I quite like that is what your photographs do. They talk about truth, illusion, and experience through time as well. Like, it's not just in that one specific instant. As you say, it's matching up to Victorian paintings and thinking about like the origins of the camera. And yeah, so I think that your practice is something that is very interesting and innovative with photography. And I like that you're using cameras as well that you just sort of find or work with or operate in different ways. It's also like even the object that you're using is connected to yourself.
Oh, yeah.
It's sort of an extension of who you are, your way of seeing, rather than just that's the best
mechanical
camera. I need this camera because that's how it's going to become. It's sort of like you have this connection to the object that is going to facilitate that image, which I think is quite special.
I mean, I am very much like to be involved in the process throughout, concept, the means of making, and actually the print. When it comes to, because I obviously don't have access. I've got access to a colour darkroom, but in terms of a huge inkjet printer, I work with Charlie Meacham directly for most of my outputs that go to exhibitions now, or else they have to go to London. I used Michael Dyers in the past, but they've become a different company now, but large scale images, you've got to send that off. However, I do the work prints. But when Charlie prints my work, I'm there with him when he prints them, because I feel it's important. It's not just sending files to someone. It's about being there, because particular greens need to be green. And it's so interesting about different paper types when you start to use the inkjet process, the high spec inkjet process. Because I started to work as well, and it was through the working with the Atkinson Grimshaw and Response, when I started to respond to his still life paintings and the Memento Mori, I started to use hand moulded deckled edge paper that was made down in Couplet Mills in Somerset. Now that paper I particularly use with the deckled edge is now obsolete. It's gone, and you're kind of always working against this. However, you've got to be thinking about, well, if that's gone, what next? I just had that, the nod to printmaking, the nod to being able to, the reproducibility, and the nod to ideas around, obviously, the modernist thinker Walter Benjamin about the optical unconsciousness in terms of how we can pay more attention to, the world once it's been photographed, in terms of being able to see beyond the direct vision, in terms of Carl Blossfeldt's flower studies, or even like William Henry Fox Talbot right at the beginning. He noticed really early on that the camera captured, the time on a clock. He wouldn't become aware of that when he was taking the photograph. He wasn't aware of that. But it's extending these ideas by using the night, by using, and again, guesstimation. Because when I work at night, I don't have a light meter, and in this place now, when I took the photographs, obviously at different times, obviously with the snow, you'd get car traffic from the road, you'd get the waxing and waning of the moon. So this offered different illumination, and I think at night there's different colour temperatures in terms of seasonality.
Yeah.
And then in terms of the artificial light, there was an EU directive several years ago whereby they were changing street lights due to phasing out the sodium street lights and changing again the quality of light and the reach of light, so it more direct, the LED light, and not as kind of diffused and scattered, and not so much light pollution apparently going up into the atmosphere, because that impacts, doesn't it, on the ecology of the place, and the animals and the insects that actually inhabit those spaces, as well as humans. Who wants a big bright light outside, messing with your, circadian rhythms, etc. You do.
Yeah. Well, I think my circadian rhythm is quite off as it is. So I'm glad that there's some directive out there that is trying to make it better.
Yeah. I'm not, But it does, in terms of the work I've made in places, the light's changed.
Have you seen that over time?
I've changed the light. It's changed, because they've changed to the LEDs.
Yeah.
Or sometimes a magnesium, a white light, because obviously sodium burns at different temperatures and you get a different colour of light.
Yeah.
And obviously when a sodium light when it first illuminates, that colour temperature tends to be a slight magenta colour. Do you remember that? And then it turns into a kind of a warmer orangey glow. And that coupled with autumn is quite interesting. But then if you're doing a long exposure and the moon is rather full, you can then get, with a long exposure, the sky will actually turn white or a light grey or even a blue. Because seasonality.
What's interesting about the two night works that we've got in the Total Recall exhibition is one in Whitby. Yeah. That's very blue.
Yeah.
And then the one you've got here in St Ives, that's quite white.
Yeah.
And there are bits of yellow in it coming through as well.
That'll be from the street lamps.
And it's a really strange image. Like when I first saw it, I was quite unsure about it, because I was like, when is this? Where is it? How did this happen? It almost feels unnatural, even though you're actually taking the time for it to be as natural as possible.
Yeah, the photograph in Whitby was done on the Kershaw, but the photograph here, I got a different camera for that. a newer camera, a Fuji camera, because I wanted to distance the work from the square of Sharp's Wood and to relate to the landscape format, the rectangle of most of Grimshaw's work. So I was here, and in the snow photograph here, what was so interesting, because I was looking at the archive at the Science and Media Museum, I came across the work of J.D. Llewellyn, a photographer who photographed taxidermy in the landscape. Yeah, so that was quite interesting, because obviously photography at the time, obviously there was a slowness to capturing things. So if you had a fleeting deer through a landscape, you're not necessarily going to capture that very early on. So if you've got a taxidermy specimen, you've got more control. It's not moving anywhere, is it? It's lifelike quality that you're photographing. But what happened when I was here photographing at night, a deer literally came into view. It came into it, so it was there, I'd set up. And obviously, when I'm taking photographs at night, I rarely look through the viewfinder. Yeah. I might do that once. However, a lot of it is guesstimation in terms of exposure. Sometimes it's really difficult to actually focus, so you've got to guess your focus as well. But the deer came into view, got startled, noticed me, and then went off. But I knew that the deer, due to the illumination and the fleetingness of the deer, that wouldn't register. So you talk about photography and truth. So my experience as a producer didn't record on the photograph. There's no record of that deer. Although in terms of evidence, my visual evidence and real-time experience. Do you see? It's so interesting.
I love that. Like your memory and the factual image not matching up.
No.
Like that is fascinating.
The camera didn't record that deer. And when you speak about the work in terms of, because I did several pieces of work at Whitby at night in the moonlight, and the one at the Mercer now is, I think it's very obvious it is nighttime with the moon. However, some of the other pieces with the long exposure look again like this blend of strange paradox, daylight, nighttime. But that night in Whitby, if you've gone to Whitby, that north wind, so it was quite a stormy night that night. I had to physically hold the tripod down. Again, doesn't look like that, does it? It looks very tranquil.
So calm. I was picturing just like a dreamy moonlit night would be. I thought it would be very kind of romantic, very picturesque.
No, I think I wanted to go when there was a full moon.
Yeah.
But then when I was making the work, it was perpetual winter at some point, and Whitby got cut off with the North York Road. You couldn't actually get to it at some point. I know this was back in kind of 2009. Yeah, I started making the work in the winter, and basically that night, so I had to hold on to the tripod, and then my kind of phenomenological experience again isn't replicated. And I think, and it still happens today when I'm watching documentaries or hearing people talking about photography, and especially conversations and debates about AI now, the photography, and I suppose it's context. In terms of the truth in photography, much debated and should be. However, I'm always aware in terms of it's kind of testing those boundaries and making people think, and making people in terms of audience and their kind of curiosity is kind of opening up their minds to photography, as something that that has thought, consideration, and has a lot of kind of knowledge and background behind it. And yes, it can be a medium where you click and it's just very fleeting, and it's a capturing of a moment. It's basically got such a wide usage. And I did pose a question to the students a few months ago about, could you imagine a world without photography? Silence. Because how can you imagine a world without photography now? Obviously, there was a world without photography, not that long ago in terms of history. But obviously, picture making, before that. However, now, could you imagine now? Because it's in everyday life, every day.
Well, it's really interesting, because I often think about when I first started looking at art, and I was looking at a lot of Renaissance images, and I kept on thinking, these painters are terrible at painting landscapes, because I thought that these crazy hills and castles that they put up in the landscape, I was like, that's not true, because that's not what I see in my day-to-day. And I was thinking of like the Yorkshire moors and everything, like where I'm from. And then I went to Italy for the first time and I was like, wow, they got it right. They knew what they were painting, and they did. But it was just because I had never seen those kinds of images. I'd never experienced that kind of space. And so, you know, even these people without photography were able to kind of capture something that was real. And so I think it's been really interesting looking at how we interpret photographs as truth, and how we expect photographs to be truthful, and how we expect photography to exist to improve our understanding of a space. Fascinating, because obviously people have done similar things with different medium before that machine was produced, and it's really interesting going now into a world where fake is almost more and more common, and how people now will use that, manipulate that, or even, as you say, like you've already said in this interview, like, I didn't Photoshop this, I didn't do that. Like, there's a lot of caveats that people now put onto their work that they're doing. And I think it is such a hard thing to answer. What is life without photography? Because I think I take a picture or a video every single day.
I think a lot of people do. Not everyone has got a smartphone. Yeah, and not everyone has a phone, do they?
Yeah.
But most people do, and most people have access to a camera. And to be, gosh, there's so many ideas here, but ideas about witnessing something. However, photography, and I actually think looking at archives right from its beginnings, its source, it's always been open to certain ideas, you know, fabrication. It has, and you know, mastering the darkroom, people are very good at that, you know.
Well, when you look at old archive footage of Cecil Beaton touching people up, it's amazing what people were doing, even with just analogue photography.
And just through necessity sometimes, when the technicalities and the medium of the time, if you're exposing for the sky, you're not going to get detail in the sky if you're exposing for the sea. So you'd do, you know, a combination print. You'd get a sky possibly from the same place, a different place, and put them together on an image. Or Augustus Rylander's image, you know, it's a total composite of different photographs. Fascinating again. And I think, again, you know, if you're a student of photography or even just interested in photography, it's kind of being curious and having that kind of background. I think you can then bring that to your photograph when you look at photography and, you know, different forms of art. You know, be curious, ask questions of things, you know.
Well, I often think that any form of image that you are making or presenting, no matter how you've done it, it's not real. It's not what an individual person will be experiencing anyway. So, because there's a time factor that you're missing, there's a space factor that you're missing, there's a temperature, there's a wind, there's all of these things that you're missing out on. So in a way, why not create a composite image that captures as much different information as possible to convey what you're trying to convey? Because ultimately, there is a separation between the photograph or an image, what it's presenting and what it's of, and the viewer.
Photography in itself, obviously, because photography has such a wide use, you know, it's used as, literally, it's used as evidence in court, and it's used as evidence in terms of, you know, past ideas as well, and not, however, it's kind of beyond reasonable doubt and things like that in terms of, but we've got to, I suppose it's context and authenticity, and I'm sure now, in terms of if a photograph is there and it's needed as evidence in kind of a criminal case, you would then need to have things in place for authenticity, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But I think the notion of photography, exploring ideas around truth, that's a huge debate, and it keeps rumbling on as well. And even, like I say, even more so with AI and ideas, and deep fakes. Because I suppose the tools, I think when people talk about their astonishment in terms of how things are manipulated, it's probably maybe because they don't have access to those tools, because, in the darkroom, a lot of kind of trickery happened as well. Maybe on camera as well. The Victorians were very interested in kind of spiritual photography and spirit photography. And the Cottingley fairy photographs, we're not that far from Cottingley here. Arthur Conan Doyle, again, he was interested in spirituality and spirit photography. So therefore, he actually, put them up. He felt they were authentic with the two young girls that did those photographs. Yeah. So that kind of trickery, I suppose it depends on the kind of collective consciousness and the debates that surround that time, and if the ground's fertile for things, it kind of latches on. Like the Cottingley fairy photographs, I'm sure at the time there were a school of thought that knew or thought they were fakes. However, there was another section of people who would probably think, these are real, And they're still in that imaginative space, aren't they, in terms of... But those, the young girls kind of knew, there was the kind of trickery, and they held it in terms of they didn't come clean that it was, they'd actually manufactured them in drawings until a lot later on. They kept that kind of myth going.
That's fascinating. I mean, how does that make you feel as a photographer, that your work could be kind of captured by a sort of zeitgeist of a moment?
Oh, in terms of what trickery? In terms of me tricking the viewer?
Yeah.
I don't...
Because, I feel that your work is very... it's very authentic. It's very kind of close to you, your experience, and there's a relationship between you, the camera, the printing. Everything kind of comes very authentically from you. And that, I think, is very refreshing. But obviously, you have no control over the audience.
But I'm not out to trick the viewer. Yeah. That isn't my intention. My intention is to add to ideas around photography, and processes, and connect with the actual means of making, connect and be curious and test things out and be experimental and allow things to happen, because I work in education and have done for a long time, and sometimes culturally I feel things can become risk averse, where people won't experiment because they find it difficult to embrace ideas that things could go wrong and there could be a failure. However, I couldn't work without testing things out. And when people see your work on the wall in an exhibition, if they actually saw the amount of work that goes into that, and the failure and the successes, but it's about paying attention to what is happening during the process. Do you see?
Yeah.
And I actually do like to print my work out and live with it for a bit, once I'm kind of in the process of making the work. Because sometimes when I'm making the work and I've got it printed out, can be doing something else, and I can kind of catch it, and then I can work on it, and I can work on it in my head. But it's about just keeping that moment going, keeping those ideas flowing in terms of, it's like, well, what would happen if I did this? What would happen if I did that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm not saying everything I've done hasn't, some things probably have been done before. And I think it's like with students, or even other photographers, it's like, well, that's been done before, but you haven't done it. Just try it out, because it can bring something new to your work. And because if you're working responding to on a commission, you've got to think of the audience as well, and where it's been exhibited. But I have to say, the work I've made as well, both the Atkinson Grimshaw work, Sharpswood, and the other works I've made, have shown in art galleries, in public spaces. So it's been able to actually reach across different audiences, and I think that's fantastic as a producer, as a maker, to actually have that as an outcome as well, to actually be able to connect with wider audiences, you know, in terms of train stations, hospitals, that you've got people like Sharp's Wood went up at St James's Hospital in the Bexley wing, where a lot of other artists exhibit work. And I went, because you can go incognito, because people don't necessarily know who you are, and I just sat there and I watched people interact with the work. And some people refer to them as paintings, and I get that because there's kind of crossovers. And then someone just wanted to touch them because they were a metre square. There was something quite tactile about them. Because obviously most photography, not all photography, is, you know, 2D framed on the wall.
Yeah.
But yet this person wanted to touch the work. And that kind of moved me really, because I thought, how interesting is that? They actually felt that connection, that they wanted to touch it.
I love watching
Yeah.
how people interact with art. And sometimes you, like as a curator, I'll place something and I think it's this or that, whatever. And then you see how people interact with it and they have a completely different experience. And, you know, you may have thought that they would flow this way and then they end up flowing that way. Yeah. And that relationship is so interesting to like just observe.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I think we can, I think it's interesting. Again, the whole process of being a creative person, being an artist, that it's not just about fulfilling a brief or doing a commission and, you know, it gets installed somewhere.
Yeah.
It's about as well about how it is received.
Yeah.
And the legacy of the work, because I think what's fantastic is the work that Grimshaw, you know, that I did for Grimshaw and for Landmarks of the Rowan leaf photograph, that it can come back out and being places in terms of under your curatorial guidance, that it that you've made decisions to put my work with other artists, because that links as well with work that I made for Chasing the Gloaming, was then selected by Laura Turner, the curator at York Art Gallery, to be put with Dutch and Flemish still life painters in York Art Gallery. And now that just, I was aware of all this work, you know, I'd go to art galleries, but I then paid attention. I saw the crossovers and saw the ideas around light, the memento mori, and basically the attention to detail. Because the work, with the commission Atkinson Grimshaw work, Chasing the Gloaming, I used to my studio was outside. That's where I made work. But through the commission that Jane gave me, I started to make work in the studio as well, and then access collections, because I needed a reference to find a dead bird, because I was responding to Atkinson Grimshaw's dead linnet painting in Leeds Art Gallery, and I was able to go to Leeds Art Gallery and other galleries in the region to actually see up close, you know, beyond the repro of a book, the actual object, the painting. So I went and studied those, but then I started to respond to the still life paintings. So that work I made then got put curatorially chosen into another exhibition, and then that gave way to another body of work called Recollections, where I worked with the natural science curator Jerry McGowan at Bradford Museums and Galleries, and looked at their zoological specimens and then kind of distilled it down to British vertebrate specimens, mammal and birds, and looked at, now this again, you see all the connections that opened up to looking at ideas around landscape, ecology, habitat, place.
This is amazing.
Through a collection, because these collections are fascinating. I love collections. I find them fascinating. I try and get students involved as well, you know, by taking them to places. But what I found fascinating, so much to talk about, but was the data labels. Because when an object or a specimen gets accessioned into a museum, and then the taxidermist processes them to actually either put them as a study skin for studying, they're not mounted to look alive, they're actually put on a stick so you can study them, or they're mounted to look alive, and then you get a little data label that tells, where they were found, if known, how they died, if known, the date, if known, the sex, if known, and basically their binomial name. So, for instance, a barn owl, Tato alba, yeah? So you'd get all this wonderful information, tiny label. But to me, I put that in the exhibition because it located the specimen, if known, to an actual place in the landscape.
Yeah.
But whilst that body of work was from the archive in Bradford, some of the specimens were from Wales and from Scotland. And that exhibition toured, and it went to Glasgow to street level up there, and people still connected with it because they had their own, like you were saying, we have our own stories. And these can prompt our own stories, or we can dig deeper into the stories and inhabit different spaces, can't we? Whether it's imagination, whether it's real, whether we want to read more around these subjects.
Well, that's been one of the joys about the exhibition that we've got on the Mercer at the minute, is we've got these 5 contemporary artists we've invited to come in and place their works alongside what we have in the collection, including your pieces, and they have just invigorated different conversations that weren't as at the forefront before. And everybody can come and have their own perspective. I even had somebody come into the gallery the other week to look at a Shackleton painting, not because of that image that we've got on the show, but just because Shackleton did a portrait in their village of some landowner, and we've now got this very strange Shackleton scene called The Passing Hour of these people frolicking in water. Very, very different. But just that own personal connection of like, I'm going to come to this space because it relates to my village, my hometown, whatever. And I think that's a really, really powerful thing. And what I love about those labels is we're kind of doing that now. You put that label on your image and we're now back where you've taken it. We've gone back into the landscape and we're exploring it. And I've learned so much about Grimshaw during this conversation than I have really thought about when I've done my own research, like in books. I've very much thought of Atkinson Grimshaw as this sort of quite staid Victorian
you need to look at his
painter. And that just is like renowned for these moonlight images, but now I'm getting this whole kind of like connection to the present through your work, and that is something that I wasn't expecting. I think that's a very powerful thing, that you basically reinterpreted this person and made it exciting for me today.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think that was the intention when Jane Sellers commissioned the work as well. And landmarks as well with the Rowan leaf, to kind of, because I responded to the photographic collections at the Mercer, which holds Julia Margaret Cameron, Victorian Tastadine, the fantastic contemporary artist who's so versatile with her medium. But obviously, ideas around film, she does a fantastic, it's probably still available on iPlayer. Tastadine talks about film, the idea of film and the materiality of film in terms of being an artist. And it's a fascinating conversation she has there in terms of, again, but she talks about, again, weaves in the ideas around things becoming obsolete, being able to process film, especially if it's 16mm film, if you're a filmmaker, but again, it's working on, because basically I'm working at the moment in a colour darkroom, where I did my doctorate studies at Sunderland. I'm using their colour darkroom, and there are conversations in a conference that has recently been at Westminster University around the darkroom being this creative tool, and how it not just that, but how it can, in terms of engage with current debates around so much, in terms of criticality, in terms of visuality, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of history as well. Because when you're working in a colour darkroom, it's black, it's dark, you're working in the dark. And actually it's made me, listening to people's papers in that conference, and I went to another conference at De Montfort in terms of history of photography. So I just found it's such a rich theme. And obviously you've always got to pay attention to, whilst looking at archives, not just the photographic history of that time, but what was, like you were saying, what's the bigger picture of that time? What are the stories of that time? Because context is everything, but then what can translate, or what threads can be brought into the present day? What concerns are still here? I mean, in terms of the photographic process itself, in terms of the pollution and impact on, landscapes and habitat, in terms of, paper production, mining for silver, all this impact.
I've seen some amazing photography recently that is based on using natural characters. And that's been really beautiful, because sometimes what did I see? There's a photographer who was using mint. I just remember the mint ones because they had this like really beautiful diffusion of light that was fascinating. And there's rhubarb as well. And then also using pond water and all these sorts of things. I just found it fascinating because it gave a totally different perspective on the medium. And was definitely not in the style of Instagram. There wasn't anything kind of like, in focus. It was loose. There was sort of like a calmness even within those kind of photography. But it's interesting thinking about the darkroom as a place of pollution. And the sort of positives and negatives that it can be, like this. I mean, I don't know. I've never been in a darkroom.
Never been in a darkroom?
No, I've never been.
You need to come into a darkroom. Invite you to come to our darkroom at the university. It's fabulous. We've got a black and white darkroom. But going into a darkroom, I think, again, there's a lot of photography courses that don't have darkrooms, and I totally understand that. But we have a black and white darkroom, and there's something, when someone hasn't developed in real time in the black and white darkroom under red light, because black and white paper doesn't have that sensitive to that red end of the spectrum, so you can see. Once you see that print, the latent image being developed, that is still a magical moment. And actually watching students who've come to photography, they don't necessarily know analog, they don't understand it in analog terms. So it's quite interesting to watch and acknowledge their response, and then start conversations around that. But it is, I think a darkroom experience does connect you to interesting methods. And like I say, I'm returning back to the darkroom as a space to create work, and ideas around, you see, there's even ideas, if we go even back in terms of truth in photography, a lot of people think you need a camera to make a photograph. Well, you don't.
Well, I really want to do all of these non-photographic things because I think they sound so cool. It sounds impossible to my mind, because I'm like, you need microchips, you need all of these different things, you need everything. I mean, all the equipment that I'm using has been charged up this morning. Everything is kind of cabled, and so when I hear about these like pinhole cameras,
fantastic.
In my mind, I'm like, this is witchcraft.
But the pinhole, again, you're going back to the primary occurrences of light and time and sensitivity. And you've got to be respectful of it. You can't just load your paper up in white light or else it'll expose. And you've got to pay attention. But it's very much about you handling the fabric of things as well. You're actually in touch with the actual whole process of it. But this is not me. I am interested in digital. I'm interested in digital photography and what that can bring, and ideas around Photoshop too. I'm not, just stuck in the past, and I'm exploring now in terms of hybrid working. Working through ideas through analog, and I'm very fascinated as well with the negative. From William Henry Fox Talbot, in terms of his process, how the negative existed. Daguerre's was a positive image and there was one off, but obviously the negative gave us means to reproducibility, infinite amounts, and so does digital. That gives us infinite amounts of reproduction, doesn't it? But the idea about the visual negative and then working from that and being playful and non-camera methods, by using the actual light sensitivity of the paper and the subject. So either through contact processes that Talbot did and Atkins did, where you've got the light sensitive material, you've got the object, you've got daylight, and then you go through different, you process it and you fix the image, because with photography very early on it was about fixing the image, because people could visualize things quite early on, but then things would fade and disappear. Mind you, some artists have used that. We recently had a student who this year worked with Cathanol. She actually working with alternative processes, and there's the Sustainable Darkroom who work with alternative processes. So there's a lot out there. And I think what's fantastic about photography, and generally, it's accessibility, as a medium to explore. And I suppose if you're working digitally, in terms of cost, it's quite low cost if you're just doing, you're just looking at things and paying attention and noticing things,
Well, I think a lot of the conversation we've had so far, you've been talking a lot about connections and time and processing, and you do a lot of commission-based work. So is that because you get to have that kind of time to return to things and present work that offers a multiple perspectives, rather than it just being a singular kind of insight into a singular moment?
I tend to work, and I think so interesting. I think once you start to have a practice and you start to make work, I think you discover more about yourself and how you work. So I think when I've started to make work,
No, I'm sorry, I'm just laughing because I write a lot of articles, and I always joke that I'm actually never writing about what I'm writing about, I'm always writing about myself.
That's interesting. Well, that's something I probably need to come back to in terms of like Mark Crocker, a person who writes about nature, naturalist. He had a debate with Robert Macfarlane and about burgeoning ideas and obviously the growing market for nature writing, that genre, and how he felt quite a lot of nature writing went into more nature literature because it responded to place, but the person was reflecting themselves on the space. And he felt there should probably different definitions of that. But I'm interested. I do read a lot about people and their experience of landscape, whether it's about themselves, whether they're working something through in their life and the backdrop is a landscape or various landscapes. I'm really interested in that personal aspect. But I'm always interested, like Raina Wynn and the Salt Path, when she and her husband lost their home and then they just set off on this journey. And it is about their lives, and it is about how we view people, homeless people as well, and the prejudice they experienced. And that, but then from that experience, how she reevaluated her life and her husband, with a serious illness, an ongoing illness that restricted.
But I suppose your photography as well, just in terms of, as we've said, the objects that you're using to put that thing out, it is very connected to you. And I think looking at the landscapes that are personal to you and you've chosen and those kind of snapshots.
I think with the Grimshaw, I chose landscapes that were particular to him. Like I did go into Leeds city centre, and it was quite interesting when you were saying that in Italy that you went and certain landscape architecture was as you thought, as you'd imagined it and seen it as well in the paintings you'd looked at. Well, with Grimshaw, when I went into the city centre, obviously artistic licence in his paintings, he'd moved buildings to actually fit a composition. So when I went to make the work there, things had changed as well. However, the way he'd composed things didn't exist in real time. He'd shifted things. Which people do, shifting things around. But in terms of going back to your original question about making a series, I just think that's what I do. And I think that's it. I think it's inherent in the medium, isn't it? Multiples. I think it's just that the means of making, and I think that just becomes embedded in the way I work that I can do this. So recently when I was in the colour dark room, you know, and the work that came out of the machine, you know, it's colour negative printing, you know, and positive printing, it came out of the machine. So I had a bit of time to review because I'm in daylight.
Yeah.
But then I'm noticing things. So I'm actually accommodating as I'm making work, going, oh, that's interesting. Or, oh, how's that happened? You know, because sometimes within photography, you know, little accidents occur or things that are unintentional. And then if you notice it, you can then pick up on it. But that in itself, in noticing things, it's a muscle you got to flex in some respects, because it isn't. And I am aware of this when you teach as well. You can't just presume the students have this. You've got to build on that through their experience. And literally, the best thing you can do if you want to learn more about photography and your subject and about yourself, you've just got to go out there or stay in. Start building small bodies of work, you know, to kind of see how the world looks photographed. I'm stealing that. That isn't mine, by the way. That's Gary Winogrand, isn't it? I'm pinching that one, but we all do that. You know, as David Hockney says, well, artists steal and put their own glitter on things. You know, it's a continuing thread of conversation, isn't it?
Well, I love what you've said, because it really annoys me sometimes when people are like, put the phone away, stop taking photos, live in the moment, because I kind of feel that, like, actually I can then go back to that moment. I then notice these things that I didn't see before. Right. I actually can then, when I return to that place, have a better understanding of, like, oh, well, I saw this in my picture, where is it? And I can respond better. Or I know what to look for more without the device. But it's only through actually using that device or, like,
as a memory.
An
aid to memory.
Yeah.
Aid memoir. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I feel like it's almost a reductive thing to say, don't take that photograph, put that phone away, because you can learn so much, you can have such a good experience with photography.
But it goes back again to the much referenced Walter Benjamin, isn't it, about the aura, you know, in like the Mona Lisa, that has its particular aura because it's the original, and then how it gets lessened by reproducibility.
Yeah.
However, again, there's as much conversations, counter conversations to that now. But I always do, in terms of the original, you know, making work with Grimshaw, to actually see the original, you know, to see the facture of the paint, the actual paint on the canvas, to actually look in detail, to be able to study it. You see, and I understand the legacy of a book, and I understand the versatility and portability of a book, and the internet, of how we, and the phone, how we consume, because how we consume things, isn't it? But I wanted to pay attention, to spend time with, to look. And I don't know, I've just out of the top of my head, in terms of looking, I remember a moment we'd gone with the students and we'd gone down to London on our trips, and we were in the National Portrait Gallery, and there was Titian's Diana, huge painting, massive painting, and there was Vivienne Westwood looking at this painting.
Amazing.
And it was really fascinating, because the students, we were in a different, could look through, and I just went, look, come look at this. And they looked through, and it's like, wow, and they were like, well, what's she doing? I said, just, you know, inspiration, she's curious, and she was just there, going about her business, but she was seated, just looking at the painting. She was just, you know, she was absorbing herself into that painting, noticing things. And I found, and you couldn't take photographs, but I have that picture in my head of that moment between her as a creative person, you know, and the painting, and just going in there, you know, getting on with it, but going to the primary source. And like landscape, your primary source.
I mean, it has been phenomenal sitting here in the landscape of that photograph with you today, because I felt the sun come and go, I felt the clouds overhead, the birds, the water, the cars in the background.
The cars,
and just feeling for the past sort of like hour this moment, and like it's almost like we're in the eye of the storm. And we're in this primary space, primary source, and you know, we've had horses go by, and everything.
She was on a phone.
And on it, I did.
Is that legal?
So, it's just funny to be so in the landscape and kind of so hidden.
And the smell.
The smell. There's something really special about actually making that photograph come to life. Because I've never been here before. I've only seen it in your picture. And
do you feel it had captured? Because I'm interested in the essence of things.
Yeah.
So how, now I know we're not at night, but in terms of the essence, do you feel that was conveyed?
Well, what's really funny is when we sat down here and we set up, I didn't recognise it. I didn't recognise this spot. But now that I've spent time here, I can see the certain trees, and it's almost like I've done a long exposure, because slowly that image that you've taken has come into view in my mind, and it's fascinating to see it.
But maybe,
it's a totally different image in some ways, but at the same time, there is this magical nature to where we are, because, as I say, we've had all of these things happen around us. We're in this quiet place, or maybe not quiet,
not too quiet.
But and it's like the world is happening around us and we're still.
But I feel, listening and hearing you, I think it's quite interesting when we're talking about photography, and I think there's an expectation for speed.
Yeah.
A lot of speed, processing, how we process things, speed, quick. And sometimes if we allow our minds to comprehend and actually understand things through processes in the brain, to actually make those connections, because sometimes we're expected to react. And photography can be quite reactionary, because we can, I like that, as we go around. However, if you just slow down a bit, and I'm not saying you slow down in life for everything, I'm just saying just take a bit of time, slow down a bit. And then slow down in terms of your thoughts around things, and you kind of will reap the rewards, because things will come into your imagination, things could come into your ideas, in terms of how you want to progress with things, or things will just go back into the recesses of your mind to be kind of capitalised on later or not, Because we kind of, it's about, again, going back to David Hockney in terms of, he said he's got a strange relationship with photography, because he always battles with it in terms of time, because he feels it's just that kind of segment in time, and painting can depict so much time. But in terms of time in photography, that can be in itself, and light, such important concepts in themselves.
Yeah.
And in terms of the idea that photography is, possibly relates a lot to the fraction of time, but opening out, that extended moment to actually bring more into play.
Yeah.
Again, about this kind of colour.
That's what I love about the gallery space and having your work there, is it's kind of a zone that is outside of time, and you can take your time to interpret. And every time I come across your works, whether they're, because as well as these two amazing night images, we've also got one image of sort of your examination of almost like a Victorian anthropological bit of vegetation, bit of nature. I don't know where you discovered these leaves from, but there is this idea of like monumental time in the work, and you can come back, and every time I look at them I see something new. I see a different kind of like vein in the leaf, or I see a different strain of light, or just because of my mood, whether I'm bleary-eyed in the morning or wide awake after lunch or whatever, I'm noticing something else. And I think it's really nice to have that time in a gallery to just look, contemplate and experience, a bit like going into nature and just sitting, listening, looking, hearing,
feeling.
It's fantastic. Well, I get a lot of feeling from your photography. I'm really excited to go back actually and look at some Atkinson Grimshaw.
Oh yes, yeah. I do. I still go. If I'm in Leeds, I'll go to the gallery and obviously past the wonderful Henry Moore sculpture.
Have you got anything coming up, any projects coming up that people can engage with, or what's the next exhibition? Or
I've got some work at Dean Clough, and that was a project like Matter where I responded to the works in terms of ideas and contributions to photography and artificial light. Joseph Swan, notable inventor of the incandescent light bulb. So I kind of worked with ideas. I kind of did a lot of research around him and his contemporaries in terms of John Hancock. So that works at Dean Clough in the Photographic Gallery at the moment. But I am making work around ideas around the artist's garden, ideas around processes in photography. This is the work I'm making now. Ideas around, you know, the culture behind the garden, the history behind the garden, the English garden, and I'm starting with my garden, proximity to subject matter. So I'm working at night. I've borrowed a camera from work. I've got a medium format camera as well. It's a digital one, and it absolutely sees the world very differently. Again, yeah, new bit of kit. And the rendition at night, how it sees the night, is so very different to what I've worked with before. I'm still working with film. I'm still working with hybrid media. And I've recently had a print made from the work I've made. And I've shown some people within the photographic community, some curators. There's interest. There's a fizz of interest. And to me, getting that kind of validation or the factor of feedback from your peers, I think is of much value too. So I feel, you know, I don't create work, you know, totally in the dark room and not show it to anybody. I like to get, you know, ideas and discuss things with my peers.
I think that's really good.
And get feedback.
You can have things shown to you that you might not have picked up on.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And suggestions, because even if you work with someone you're working with an archive, sometimes people say, well, have you considered looking at the work of? And you might say, well, I know that work, but then you might not have seen it in real time. Because a lot of historical work, if you think of early photography, a lot of that work is quite small scale. You know, it needed Joseph Swan's terms of processes to actually make enlargement and photographic prints more stable so they could be enlarged further. So a lot of historical photography can be quite small.
This is fascinating. I think we could talk for hours because you are obviously working at the sort of intersection of photography, collage in a way, science, anthropology, and I love that we've been able to open up that from one image, one photograph, that research, that breadth behind it that is often kind of missing, because, you know, in a gallery we often just put a tombstone label that's like name, title, everything, but it's been wonderful to hear the process, the perspectives and everything behind what's going on. I'm really excited to see these works when they're done. I think it's that excitement that keeps me going, that buzz, you know, the fizz when you're making work and you suddenly think, ooh, where does that go? What we're doing with that? And it's that recognition, isn't it, that this is working. Because you make a lot of work. It's brilliant. I show a clip that Martin Parr did to students, and basically he says, in terms of you've got to make a lot of work for that one image. It's so true. You know, you've got to keep your ideas going, and that moment of kind of like reflective practice, or reflective, in terms of just, where is this going? Because there are so many different departure points. It's literally infinite, isn't it, where you could take things. That's why you need to, again, work in some constraints, or else you'd never, you know, you'd be a bit lawless in terms of being commissioned, wouldn't you? But there was one recent commission that I did with other artists, and that was making work in Dolby Forest. And I made work that actually was exhibited, and the other artists did. There were sculptures, photographers, painters, and made work that actually was exhibited in the forest. I love that.
And that was brilliant. That has sparked my imagination in terms of...
I've wanted to create in nature for a long time.
Do it. And because you could get all different practitioners in there. Because I think it's sort of a lot of joy in a group show. Because you start... It's like Alba's vibrating boundaries, you know, with colour, that you've got a different artist that connect unexpected connections that fizz or kind of conflict, or they actually complement each other. Because not all art has to be, there can be things that are uncomfortable in the work,
Yeah. And I think that is something that is very hard for audiences or for people to learn. Like, I've definitely learned through art history to sit with uncomfortableness and to be challenged and to have perspectives change and shift. And that's a really hard thing to process as a person. And if you're not taught how to handle it, if you're not or not even taught, but given a chance to do that. And I think art is one of the few spaces where you have to become comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I think that's it's a very powerful experience.
And I just think I think it's an important point as well, the idea in aesthetics and the idea of beauty in the art world, and how I feel sometimes that there should be wider conversations of beauty. Fiona Reynolds wrote a book on the fight for beauty and how she wanted to bring it, not just resided in aesthetics, but bring it in as a critical tool. And I feel there's much that artists, can contribute to that if something is beautiful, it can still connect with wider debates. It can still be, in some ways, confrontation. It can still...
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that beauty in, the art world is almost quite, risque to talk about. Because it's quite unfashionable.
Absolutely.
And I think beauty is almost one of the uncomfortable conversations to have, that we need to have as an art community.
But I think recently I listened and went to a talk at the Aesthetica conference, and I'm a big fan of Ori Gerst's work, and he does use beauty as a tool. To engage audiences for his own practice, and he does it magnificently. And I just find his work fascinating, and he uses, obviously, technology of now as well. It really is, and it's just, I find his work fascinating.
That's so interesting. I would love to have another conversation with you about this. But I think we need to wrap this up because we're just going off in all of these really fascinating rabbit holes. But thank you so much for joining me today. That's actually the noise saying we've got to wrap up because battery power is now low. So we've got to go. But thank you as well for joining us today. I hope you found that really interesting. Come to the Total Recall show in Harrogate at the Mercer Gallery and have a look at these photographs that we've been talking about at length today.
Thank you. Lovely to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.